I think conflict is actually maybe the most important thing to think about when you guys are thinking about the stories you're creating, because it's very easy to create kind of self-serving spectacles that represent what you want to say. But the conflict of your story is going to be the main driver of creative executions and creative content, right? So who's against who? So there are a couple different types of content. Like if you look at, a very traditional kind of conflict you have is like brand versus brand. I worked on this campaign called the Slow Skis, which like all we did was like attack brands, but that's one kind of conflict, right? And then the content you're creating are basically like argument points to like, you're basically shit talking, right? And shit talking is pretty fun. Like that kind of starts to create a lot of content for you. But even if you look at games like something like God of War, like that's really about you, and it's about you trying to like beat yourself and beat the game, but it's a really kind of personal conflict. Whereas something like Mafia Wars is inherently like a social game, right? So if you're trying to create personal conflict, what you have to do is set up types of achievement, like many kind of things people can access, achieve, many kind of obstacles for them. That's where you're going to create all your content. But if you're creating a social conflict between groups that actually exist, what you need to do is bait them, right? So that's what your content's going to be. So that's what like Whopper Sacrifice does so well. So you kind of you create content on both sides of the conflict to do that. And then if you look at something like the Dove Campaign for Real Beauty, that is the very much like man versus society conflict, right? It's like there are all these women who have these, who have bodies, but the society is telling them their bodies aren't good. That's a kind of great conflict to have. But if you identify that conflict, what your goal is always to create content that empowers people on one side. You have a side on that conflict, and to escalate the argument, right? Like you just always want to make it bigger and bigger. So I guess what I'd say is you guys should think about what's the conflict, who's against who, and then how could you make this conflict more dramatic? What do you need to do to make that conflict more dramatic? What's the kind of content you need to create, right? To do so. Like God of War doesn't really need to create like a conflict where they're saying like we're better than this other game. That's not really going to help people do that. Coke and Pepsi, if they're really in the cola wars, like when we were doing the Slow Skis, which was basically Comcast versus DSL, we didn't have to say so too much about what we did, which was really great. We basically said like DSL really sucks, man, those guys suck, and that's actually what like made that story most compelling. So think about what your conflict is and how you can create more of it. I think another thing which is really important is to think about, do you have enough of the story? So we did this campaign called Haagen-Dazs Loves Honeybees. Have you guys heard about this? Basically, in a nutshell, for a couple years ago, they just kind of figured out what's happening. Honeybee populations were dying off, so like just thousands and thousands, like a huge percent of the population of honeybees were dying off. And we actually took that as our campaign for Haagen-Dazs. So there is one example that's from us. And basically said, when honeybees die off, that's bad for Haagen-Dazs because they are actually responsible for fertilizing like 60% of the ingredients we use. So if the honeybees die off, like we can't make our ice cream anymore. It worked quite well, our strategy, right? So we developed this whole campaign called Haagen-Dazs Loves Honeybees. We wanted to save the honeybees. We created all these things. We had a TV spot. We had print ads about it. Some of the more interesting things we did were little dance numbers, which were viral videos that you could share where like honeybees came back. They just found nectar. They did weird, crazy dance moves, and then they all died. We had a print ad, which was this piece of seed paper you could rip out from a magazine, crumple up, and plant, and it would grow flowers. So there was more stuff for honeybees to use. And then we had an ice cream flavor that we made called Vanilla Honeybee with the client, where if you bought that, like all the profits went to UC Davis to research why honeybees were going extinct. And I think what's interesting here is two things. One is that for every story, you kind of need to know all the pieces. There was a point when we were selling this to the client where they said, we love this idea, it's so great, we can't do the ice cream flavor. And I think you need to, especially when you start dealing with clients who want to just whittle away at things, not all of them, some of them, you need to figure out like what are the necessary elements for this story, right? What are all the different things we need as plot points? And we said, that's fine, if you can't do the flavor, that's great, we'll come up with another idea. And they said, no, we love this idea, we'll do it. We said, you can't do it without with the flavor. You need some skin in the game, otherwise no one's going to believe this story. So I think it's important to figure out what are all the elements. And the other thing is it's very easy, and I think we've done this sometimes, to develop a story where you come in one way and then you learn about everything else. But this campaign actually had multiple entry points. I think some campaigns can get away with this. some Halo campaigns, I think, do a really great job of like, you have to understand every element to understand what the campaign's doing, or you come in through the TV and then you like go into this immersive website. But we couldn't do that. We were talking to everyone. Like, we couldn't make it super cryptic. So if you bought the ice cream, you started to hear our story. If you saw the print ad, you started to hear the story. If you saw the TV spot, which we only aired a couple times, we only had it so we could have footage for news shows to run, you got into the story. So all of these became ways into the story, and ultimately it ended up with our client testifying before Congress about the honeybee crisis, and that again became a way into the story. So I would say think about all the elements you need and always create multiple entry points into your story. It's not like novels where you have to start at the first page. What if someone opens the middle of the book? Are they going to be able to get what's happening and come into the story?
I think another important piece for plot when you're talking about these ideas that live in a transmedia space is understanding, just at a very simple level, what's scripted and what's being staged. So for Skittles, I think some of the TV work they've done is just really weird and really awesome, and it really gets you laughing and you understand the brand. And I think that's great. But I know that actually whatever agency was doing that work wasn't able to crack kind of the social media aspect of the project. So that went to a smaller agency that's in San Francisco, Evolution Bureau. And I just saw them present this video they won at Cannes. They started, sort of the idea was mob the rainbow. So instead of taste the rainbow, mob the rainbow. And it was just really simple and nuanced, and it sort of it showed a lot of intelligence about the social space. So the first idea was just around Valentine's Day, so kind of capitalizing on a moment when there's already a lot of natural conversation. They wanted to send Valentines to a person who's incredibly unbeloved, and that's a parking ticket officer. So they got 43,000 people to write Valentines to just some random, parking ticket officer. And they've done this over and over again, so they've had multiple mobs. I think they just launched one recently called Dazzle the Rainbow, where I think they have a guy in a booth with 3.7 million Skittles suspended above him, and each share or tweet, I think they're gonna release like a couple Skittles, and the goal is to bury him in sugar, which I think is kind of funny. And it's worked because what I remember from the case study was they started with 3.5 million fans or so on Facebook, which is a completely respectable number, but after all these mobs, which were kind of small one-off stage stunts of types, they got up to around 10 million fans in a couple months, and that's really incredible growth. So again, Skittles, I just think they understand how to play both sides of the fence and understand when it's right to script a spot that's hilarious and when you need to open it up a lot more and let people kind of play with the story. And then, I think this is one of the last examples, but thinking of how we experience stories, you can think of what happens before, during, and after the meat of the story. For in this case, I like Star Wars, I also like Lord of the Rings, those are my slides. But you look at A New Hope, right? A classic text, it's entered, it builds off of Greek mythical structure, the hero narrative, it has it all there. So that's kind of the text in and of itself existing in the space in which it was created. Then on the far left, there was a blog article recently kind of around the origins of Chewbacca. And this was one of the early drawings for Chewbacca, and he kind of looked like this weird giant gecko, and he didn't have hair. And just the act of reading this blog narrative, which was part of kind of a retrospective interview with George Lucas, can't help but affect your understanding of the story as it exists now. And then on the far right, there's this whole genre for a lot of these sort of classic stories of fan-generated fiction. So, this is kind of an alternate universe where there's a dark Leia, and she kind of goes over to the dark side and partners up with her pops, Darth Vader. He apparently obviously doesn't die in this story. And again, that's something that was created by fans in this story, in this world that George Lucas created, that exists outside of and after the main plot of the story. But when taken together, it does kind of create this larger, more expansive and more inclusive experience for the audience.